At just 10 years old, Eric Thompson stood in the back of a dusty barn, clutching a coffee tin filled with crumpled bills and coins, his entire life savings. His heart raced as he watched the auctioneer's hammer fall with a loud crack, signaling the start of the bidding for a sick German shepherd named Thunder. Most people in the room saw a worthless animal, destined for euthanasia, but Eric saw something different. Despite his small frame and the disapproving glances from the adults surrounding him, he stood tall, his chin lifted, determined to make a difference for this dog that no one else wanted. As Thunder huddled in the corner of the pen, his ribs protruding and his eyes clouded with fear and defeat, Eric didn't see an untrainable animal. He saw a broken soul, a creature that had been abandoned and neglected but still holding on to a faint glimmer of life. The auctioneer warned Eric that the dog had been returned twice from the service dog program, was likely sick, and would probably never be able to be trained. But Eric wasn't deterred. With a steady voice, despite the storm of anxiety swirling inside him, he bid on Thunder, offering everything he had saved up over the years. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as Eric stepped forward, his small hands trembling but his resolve unshaken. "I'll take him now, please," Eric said, his voice clear and firm. At that moment, something passed between him and Thunder, an unspoken connection, a silent promise. Thunder's amber eyes locked with Eric's, and for the first time in a long while, Eric could see a flicker of hope. He knew this moment, despite the doubts and warnings from others, would change both their lives forever. Eric had no idea what to expect as he carefully guided Thunder home. The dog, still visibly weak and emaciated from his past, walked slowly beside him, his movements hesitant. Eric's heart thudded in his chest, a mixture of hope and uncertainty swirling in his stomach. He had never been responsible for anything this big before, and the weight of caring for another living creature, one who had suffered so much, felt overwhelming. What if he couldn't make a difference? What if, despite all his efforts, Thunder remained broken? The questions gnawed at him, but the determination in his heart kept him going. He couldn't abandon the dog now, not after everything Thunder had been through. As they reached the front door, Eric's mother stood in the doorway, watching quietly. She didn't speak right away, but Eric could see the concern in her eyes. She had heard the rumors about Thunder, about the neglect and abuse, and she must have been wondering if bringing him into their home was the right choice. But she didn't voice any doubts. Instead, she simply stepped aside, making room for Eric and Thunder to enter. Eric led the dog to the corner by the fireplace, where a small wooden crate had been prepared for him. Thunder hesitated, unsure of his new surroundings, his eyes wide with suspicion. The room smelled different from the cold, barren place he'd come from, but the warmth of the fire didn't immediately put him at ease. Eric crouched beside the dog, speaking to him softly, his voice steady and calming. "It's okay, Thunder. You're safe now. You're home." His words felt like a promise, and he could only hope that Thunder would understand. But the dog didn't respond, instead curling up in the corner, his body tense and alert, as though ready to bolt at any moment. Eric felt a pang of sadness. He wished he could do more to ease Thunder's fear, but he knew that trust couldn't be rushed. It would take time, and Eric was willing to be patient. Over the next few days, Eric threw himself into caring for Thunder. He woke up early, feeding him small portions of food and cleaning him up the best he could. The dog, though still thin and weak, started to show signs of improvement. He would follow Eric around the house, though at a distance, watching him with cautious eyes. The moments when Thunder looked up at him with those sad, soulful eyes made Eric's heart ache. He couldn't imagine the pain and fear Thunder had endured, but he promised himself that he would make sure the dog never had to face that kind of life again. The days turned into weeks, and Eric's bond with Thunder grew stronger. He spent hours training the dog, teaching him to trust his commands, but there were setbacks. Sometimes, Thunder would cower at a raised hand, or flinch at a sudden movement. Eric's heart would sink each time, and doubt would creep in. Was he doing this right? Was Thunder ever going to fully recover? But there were also moments of hope. A wag of the tail. A soft, trusting look. Thunder, though still fearful at times, was beginning to trust him. Slowly but surely, he was learning that not all humans were cruel, and not all places were filled with fear. Eric felt a growing sense of pride each time Thunder made progress. The dog's hesitant steps became more confident, and the nervousness in his eyes began to fade. Eric could see the dog becoming stronger, physically and emotionally, and it filled him with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He knew that healing wasn't a straight line, that there would be setbacks and difficult days, but he also knew that he had made the right choice. Thunder had come into his life for a reason, and they were both learning to heal from the scars of their past, one day at a time. As the days passed, Eric began to realize that the bond between him and Thunder wasn't just about saving the dog, it was about saving each other. Both of them had been broken in different ways, and now they were learning how to heal together. The dog's trust was still fragile, but each time Thunder looked at him with gratitude, Eric knew that they were making progress. And that, more than anything, was enough. As the weeks passed, Eric's connection with Thunder grew stronger, deeper than either of them had anticipated. The bond between them had started quietly, small moments of trust, of Thunder inching closer, allowing Eric to care for him, but now it was evolving into something profound. Eric could feel it in his chest, a warmth that bloomed every time Thunder looked at him with those soft, trusting eyes. Thunder wasn't just a dog anymore, he was a companion, a friend. But it hadn't always been easy. Thunder's past left scars, physical, emotional, and psychological, that Eric could not easily erase. There were days when Thunder would freeze at the slightest sound, his body trembling, eyes wide with fear. Eric would watch him in those moments, helpless, feeling a pang of guilt that he couldn't protect him from the terror that haunted him. But Eric was patient. He would sit beside Thunder, softly speaking to him, his hand reaching out in gentle assurance. Slowly, Thunder began to respond. He would inch closer, his tail wagging tentatively, his muscles relaxing just a bit. Eric would smile, whispering comforting words, feeling a sense of pride every time Thunder took a step forward, even if it was small. One morning, as Eric was getting ready for school, he felt an odd tension in the air. Thunder, who had been quiet for the last few days, suddenly stood up, his ears perked, and his body rigid. Eric froze, sensing that something was different. He watched as Thunder stared at the door, his eyes sharp, his gaze unwavering. The dog had become unusually alert, something that Eric had never seen before. His heart began to race. Was Thunder frightened again? Was there a threat outside that Eric hadn't noticed? The seconds stretched out, the silence in the room thick with anticipation. And then, the door creaked open. Eric's mother walked in, her arms full of grocery bags. Thunder didn't move immediately, but his body remained tense. Eric could see the hesitation in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. But instead of retreating, Thunder took a step forward. He was cautious, his movements slow and deliberate. For the first time in weeks, Thunder walked up to someone other than Eric, his tail stiff but slowly beginning to wag. He sniffed at Eric's mother, then carefully nudged her hand with his nose. Eric's mother, surprised but delighted, smiled softly. She bent down and gently patted Thunder's head, speaking to him in a quiet, soothing voice. Thunder, after a long moment of stillness, finally allowed himself to relax, his tail wagging more freely now. The dog's eyes softened, a hint of trust forming. Eric watched the entire exchange with a lump in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much this moment would mean to him. It wasn't just about Thunder's progress, it was a small but significant sign that Thunder was starting to believe that not everyone would hurt him. That maybe, just maybe, there was safety in this home. Eric's heart swelled with pride and relief. This was a milestone, one that spoke volumes about the healing that had already begun. It wasn't perfect, Thunder wasn't suddenly calm and carefree. But he was trying, and that was enough. Eric felt a quiet tear slip down his cheek. He hadn't expected Thunder to trust anyone so quickly. But then again, Thunder wasn't the only one who had to learn to trust. Later that day, after school, Eric spent time with Thunder in the backyard. He threw a ball, watching as the dog hesitated, then ran after it with increasing confidence. Eric couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and free. Every moment like this felt like a victory. Even the small things, like when Thunder allowed Eric to pet him without flinching or when he looked at him with a calm gaze instead of a fearful one, felt like triumphs. Eric realized that this wasn't just Thunder's journey of healing, it was his too. He was learning to be patient, to trust in the process, to let go of his own fears and doubts. He had to remind himself that healing took time, that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was progress. As the evening grew dark, Eric sat beside Thunder, their backs against the cool grass. The sky was tinged with the soft hues of twilight. Thunder rested his head on Eric's lap, his body relaxed for the first time in hours. Eric stroked the dog's fur gently, his hand moving in slow, comforting motions. "You're doing great, buddy," Eric whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He felt a deep sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't just about helping Thunder heal, it was about realizing that, in some ways, Thunder had helped him heal too. The loneliness that had once clung to Eric's heart seemed a little lighter, and he realized that the bond they shared wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about two souls finding solace in each other's company. Thunder's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing steady and calm. Eric looked down at him, his own heart full. This wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a beginning, a new chapter in both their lives. They would face more challenges, there would be setbacks, but as long as they had each other, Eric knew they could overcome anything. Together, they had found something worth fighting for: trust, love, and a bond that could not be broken. Over the following weeks, Eric's relationship with Thunder grew deeper, solidifying a bond that had started as fragile but was now becoming unbreakable. Eric had quickly come to rely on the dog's presence, even when the days were challenging. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Thunder would awaken with a quiet eagerness, his tail thumping against the floor. Eric would smile at the familiar sound, a comforting reminder that his mornings now began with something pure and uncomplicated. Their routine was simple, but Eric treasured it: feeding Thunder, getting ready for their walks, and sitting in the stillness of the mornings, just the two of them. In the evenings, after a long day, Thunder would curl up on the couch next to Eric, resting his head on his lap with complete trust. These moments, though quiet, meant the world to Eric. It wasn't just about having a dog to care for, but rather the way Thunder seemed to rely on him, seeking comfort in his presence. For Eric, it was the first time in a long while that he felt like he had someone who needed him as much as he needed them. However, despite the growing connection between them, Eric could tell there were still remnants of Thunder's past that lingered. The dog, though making progress, would sometimes flinch at loud noises, or shy away from sudden movements. Eric had learned not to react with frustration. Instead, he observed, noting the subtle ways Thunder was still dealing with his trauma. It was clear that the dog was haunted by memories, not of Eric's making, but that only made Eric more determined to help Thunder find the peace he deserved. One particularly quiet afternoon, Eric found himself sitting on the porch with Thunder, watching as the day slowly faded into dusk. The sky was painted in shades of pink and purple, and the air carried a coolness that promised the arrival of night. Thunder lay next to him, his body relaxed but his eyes alert, still cautious yet more at ease than when they had first met. Eric reached down, gently rubbing the dog's head, noting how Thunder leaned into the touch as though craving the affection. Despite his past, Thunder had begun to trust Eric, and Eric could feel that trust as a weight in his chest, both heavy and beautiful. Eric reflected on the transformation. At first, he had been so unsure of how to help Thunder, a boy with no real experience of healing trauma trying to care for a dog who had clearly suffered. The task had felt overwhelming, and there were times when Eric had been tempted to give up. But now, as he sat there beside the dog, he realized just how much they had both grown. Thunder had learned to relax, even if only for brief moments, and Eric had learned patience and empathy, lessons he hadn't expected to need. He had come to understand that healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't about reaching some end goal of perfect behavior. It was about creating an environment where Thunder could feel safe, where his fears were acknowledged and respected, and where his heart could slowly begin to heal. The realization hit Eric like a wave: he wasn't just helping Thunder. Thunder was helping him too. Over time, Eric had learned to open up in ways he hadn't before. The solitude he had once known no longer felt so heavy. Thunder had become a companion, a friend who understood without words. There were days when Eric, in the quiet moments, would sit and feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the dog, but for the bond they shared, one built on trust, patience, and understanding. Later that evening, after dinner, Eric found himself sitting at the table, his thoughts drifting to the past few months. Thunder was curled up by the window, content in his spot, eyes half closed but always keeping Eric within his line of sight. There was something about that, Thunder's ever-present vigilance, that made Eric smile. It was as though the dog had come to realize that Eric was not just the person who fed him or walked him, but the person who had given him a second chance at happiness. And Eric, in turn, had been given a second chance at understanding what it truly meant to care for another, without expecting anything in return. As Eric stood to clear the table, Thunder stretched and followed him, the sound of his paws soft against the floor. There was a moment of connection, a silent understanding passing between them. Thunder's movements were slower now, more deliberate, and Eric couldn't help but notice how the dog had become more confident in his own body. He was no longer the wary, frightened animal he had been when Eric first brought him home. Thunder was becoming a dog who knew love, who knew trust, and, most importantly, who knew that his past didn't define him. "Let's go to bed, Thunder," Eric murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thunder wagged his tail in response, his ears perking up. The dog padded slowly after Eric, and together they moved to the bedroom. Thunder jumped onto the bed, curling up at the foot of it, his body relaxed, breathing deep and steady. As Eric climbed into bed, his gaze drifted to Thunder, who was already starting to drift off into sleep. A sense of peace settled over Eric. There would still be struggles ahead, moments of uncertainty and perhaps even setbacks, but in this moment, everything felt as it should be. He had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a companion, a friend, and a reason to believe in the power of healing, both for Thunder and for himself. Eric closed his eyes, feeling a warmth in his chest, as though a weight had been lifted. He thought of how far they had both come. Thunder, once a shadow of the dog he was meant to be, now lay peacefully beside him, a testament to resilience and trust. Eric smiled, his heart full of affection for the dog who had changed his life in ways he hadn't even expected. As the night grew deeper, Eric whispered softly, "We're in this together, Thunder," and for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. As the days passed, Eric and Thunder's bond deepened in ways Eric hadn't expected. The quiet, unspoken connection between them became more pronounced. Thunder, the dog who had once been so wary and distant, was now more than just a companion, he had become Eric's emotional anchor. Every time Eric glanced at him, whether as they sat on the couch in the evenings or walked side by side down the street, he could feel a quiet gratitude settle in his heart. Thunder had begun to trust Eric more with each passing day, and in return, Eric found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. The world outside continued to move rapidly, but in their little corner of it, time slowed to a more manageable pace. One morning, as Eric sat with his coffee by the window, he watched Thunder chase after a squirrel in the yard, his tail a blur of excitement. For a brief moment, Eric's mind wandered. The image of Thunder, so carefree, stirred something within him, a long-forgotten sense of joy that Eric had nearly abandoned. He smiled softly, shaking his head. Maybe it was time to take a step forward, to push aside the walls he'd built for so long. Thunder had shown him that it was okay to let go of the past. He could start fresh, in both his heart and his life. The idea of going on a hike had crossed Eric's mind many times, but the weight of his own thoughts always held him back. Today, however, something felt different. As he watched Thunder happily prance around the yard, his energy contagious, Eric felt a sudden urge to act. Without thinking too much, he stood up from his chair, grabbed the leash from the closet, and called out, "Thunder, you want to go for a hike?" The dog's ears perked up, and his tail began to wag furiously in response. Thunder barked excitedly and jumped toward the door, eager for whatever adventure lay ahead. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, with the radio playing soft tunes in the background. Thunder, his nose pressed against the window, watched the world outside pass by with curiosity, as though every new tree, every passing car, was worth investigating. Eric, on the other hand, felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. The long stretches of highway before him were no longer a reminder of his past, but rather an open road leading to something unknown and hopeful. When they arrived at the trail, Eric took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The sun was already high in the sky, casting warm rays over the landscape. Thunder, as if sensing that this was a new kind of experience, hopped out of the car and practically dragged Eric toward the path. The excitement in the dog's eyes was palpable. His tail wagged with a rhythm that Eric could almost hear, as though the very act of moving forward was enough to bring him joy. Eric followed at a steady pace, admiring how the dog moved with such enthusiasm, his body lithe and full of life. With each step, Eric found himself more immersed in the hike. The trail wound through towering trees, their branches reaching out above them, offering a canopy of shade. The forest smelled of earth and pine, and the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind filled the air. Thunder, ever the adventurer, darted ahead, his nose twitching as he sniffed every corner of the path. Eric couldn't help but laugh at how curious the dog had become, his apprehension replaced by a boundless sense of discovery. It was a stark contrast to the Thunder Eric had first met, nervous, unsure, and shy. Now, he was full of life, his spirit unburdened, and it filled Eric with an unspoken sense of pride. They walked for what felt like hours, though Eric couldn't quite tell the time. The minutes seemed to slip by unnoticed. Thunder bounded up ahead, stopping every so often to look back at Eric as though checking to make sure he was still there. His tail swished like a metronome, setting the pace of their journey. Eric paused at one point, standing on a large rock near the edge of the trail, and gazed out over the valley below. The view was breathtaking, an endless stretch of green hills and valleys, the air still and peaceful. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment as the silence wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. For the first time in a long while, Eric felt a sense of peace that wasn't fleeting. Thunder had sat down beside him, his warm body pressed gently against Eric's leg. Eric rested a hand on his back, the steady rhythm of his breathing offering a calming presence. There was a profound comfort in the dog's companionship, uncomplicated, unjudging, and filled with a quiet understanding. Eric whispered softly, his voice barely audible against the sounds of nature around them, "I never thought I'd get to this point, Thunder." The dog's ears perked up, but he didn't move. His eyes seemed to meet Eric's, and in that moment, Eric felt as though the two of them shared a silent conversation. Thunder didn't need to respond, his presence alone was enough to communicate everything Eric needed to hear. After a while, Eric stood up, gently coaxing Thunder to his feet. They had been there long enough, and though Eric felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, the trail was waiting to be finished. The hike back down the mountain was just as peaceful, though now, Eric's steps felt lighter, more purposeful. Thunder walked beside him, his gait more confident now, as though he too had discovered something new on this journey. When they returned to the car, Eric couldn't stop smiling. Thunder, content with the day's adventure, jumped into the back seat with a soft sigh, curling up on the seat like a ball of satisfaction. As Eric started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Thunder had shown him the beauty of the present moment, of letting go of the past, and embracing the freedom that came with it. As they drove home, Eric's heart felt full, and for the first time in ages, he didn't feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. With Thunder by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. Together, they were stronger. Eric sat quietly on the couch, his fingers gently tracing the contours of Thunder's fur, feeling the warmth of the dog's body beside him. The house, though small, felt comforting now, as if it had slowly begun to mold itself around their presence. Each passing day, it seemed, Thunder grew more comfortable, more assured of his place in this new world. And in turn, Eric felt something inside of him shift, a lightness that had been absent for so long. He remembered the early days with Thunder, how the dog had been so skittish, wary of every noise and sudden movement. Thunder had been a reflection of Eric's own inner turmoil, untrusting, hesitant, always bracing for something bad to happen. But now, Thunder lay next to him, his body relaxed, eyes half closed in contentment. It was a small, simple act, but it meant everything. Eric let out a deep breath, his chest tightening and loosening as he realized how far they had both come. They had grown together, two broken souls learning to trust again. Thunder's quiet presence had a soothing effect on Eric. The dog had never asked for anything more than companionship, and in doing so, had offered Eric something he didn't know he needed: peace. There were days, especially in the beginning, when Eric felt as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him, making each step forward feel like a monumental effort. The memories of his past, the choices he regretted, the wounds that never seemed to heal, they all weighed heavily on him. But with Thunder by his side, those burdens seemed a little more bearable. One evening, as the light outside began to fade, Eric leaned back into the couch, Thunder's head resting comfortably in his lap. The room was still and quiet, save for the soft rhythm of Thunder's breathing. The silence was not uncomfortable, though; it was reassuring. Eric let his fingers gently stroke Thunder's fur as he thought back to the time before Thunder had come into his life. He remembered feeling so alone, as if there was no one who understood the weight of his struggles. Now, though, Thunder's presence had brought him a sense of calm he hadn't expected. He no longer felt the need to constantly seek validation or approval. He had found something in Thunder's eyes that made him feel grounded, like he wasn't entirely lost anymore. As the minutes passed, Eric found his mind wandering to the future. For so long, he had been afraid to look ahead, terrified that the mistakes of his past would somehow follow him into tomorrow. But Thunder had shown him the value of taking things one day at a time. There was no need to rush, no need to fix everything all at once. Slowly, Eric had learned to let go of the guilt, the fear, the doubt. Thunder had, in his quiet way, taught him that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken all at once, it was about moving forward, step by step, and finding strength in the small moments. Thunder's steady breathing grew softer as he drifted off to sleep, his body warm and content against Eric's side. Eric couldn't help but smile as he looked down at him. It was strange how much a dog could change your life. Eric had once thought he needed to control everything, that he had to have all the answers. But now, sitting in the silence, he realized that he didn't need to have everything figured out. He didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. Thunder had shown him the value of simply being in the moment, of trusting in the present, and most importantly, of trusting in himself. For the first time in a long while, Eric felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he was capable of. There was no rush, no expectation. He was finally allowing himself to breathe. Thunder, in his quiet loyalty, had helped him see that there was no need to chase after happiness. It was already here, in the small, everyday moments they shared. Eric gently stroked Thunder's back, feeling the soft rise and fall of his chest, and he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, one step at a time.